Good morning. I'm going to pick up today from where Carol Larson left off last week, and let's get you started here. So we'll start off with some big ideas, go into cognitive reading strategies, and then look at some specific instructional practices with children, and then we'll end revisiting the big ideas and provide a time for questions at the end. So when I think about my work as a teacher educator, I want to prepare teachers that provide children with the means and desire to construct themselves as responsibly literate democratic citizens. It's a big goal. And under that, teachers have control in their classroom on the pedagogical types of learning environments and experiences they provide for their students in ways that can be exciting and challenging and develop curious, independent learners. So one of the most important things we can do as teachers is be readers and thinkers ourselves. So it's our role to be active as readers, to reflect on what we read, and like Carol mentioned last week, being metacognitive, and to think about our reading and then discuss that with others as a model for kids. If that's what we're expecting for them, we want to live that as teachers. So we're using the term proficient reading strategies, cognitive reading strategies, but it has many synonyms, as you see listed here. Carol last week talked about monitoring for meaning, using and creating schema, and using sensory and emotional images. So I'll pick up where she left off, and today I'll focus in on asking questions, inferring, and determining importance. And these cognitive reading strategies come out of research in the 80s when Pearson and Gallagher and others looked at what readers do, proficient readers do. And then that work has been carried on through the decades, and we've seen this, this push in education to identify and model these strategies for our students. So if we think about the cognitive reading strategies, the goal isn't that kids can name those, though it's helpful to have common language to identify those as kids and as teachers in buildings. But our true goal is to help kids know when and how to use these strategies for the end result of enhancing their learning and understanding. So they're a means to an end. And when we teach comprehension, our goal is for students to be able to integrate and flexibly use these reading and thinking strategies in a wide variety of texts, with a wide variety of texts and engaging curriculum. We don't need to teach them singularly always, but in fact show how they overlap, and we use multiple cognitive reading strategies at once. One thing else we know from research is that reading instruction is more successful when kids are engaged and motivated. Camborne describes engagement when learners are convinced that they can do or perform the demonstrations that they're observing, and that when they observe these demonstrations from teachers, they realize that this will help further the purpose of their life. There's meaning to these activities, these instructional practices, and they can do so without any fear. So when we talk about engagement, this is what we're conceptually describing it as. One other big idea we know is the power of the social, of dialogue, of interaction, of talk with kids. And students are motivated when they have opportunities to interact with their peers, especially when they have a chance to talk about these ideas that they're complex, they're debatable, and I love this quote by Johnson, Ivy, and Faulkner, that what we say can start lines of talk that become lines of thought, and that interactive piece between thinking and talking, and providing that space for kids to do this. So in the next section, what I'd like to do is take the 3 cognitive reading strategies that I'll focus on in this webinar, which are asking questions, inferring, and determining importance. And we'll look at why readers use those strategies, for what purpose, and we'll look at some instructional practices, some ways in which teachers in the field are making this come alive for students in authentic, engaging ways. So the cognitive reading strategy, asking questions. Readers spontaneously and purposely generate questions before, during, and after reading that lead them into deeper understanding of the text. And this comes from Keene and Zimmerman's work from Mosaic of Thought. I don't know about you, but I clearly see this innate desire to ask questions. I have a 12-year-old, and just last week as we were driving, I think he produced a question every 30 seconds. Why are the starlings on that power line versus the one over there? And why are there more dead raccoons in the road than other animals? And is that character in the TV series I'm watching, is he like that in real life? And the questions went on and on. And I think that's indicative of kids' desire and humans' desire to ask questions. So why do we ask them as readers? We want to be drawn into the story. When we ask those questions, we get more engaged with the story. We want to clarify our understanding about what we just read. We make predictions on what we think will happen next. And it helps us to think often about the author's craft, why they made the decisions they made. So what I'd like to do is, for each of these instructional strategies, or these cognitive reading strategies, I'd like to model with a think aloud, with me modeling how to use this strategy, and then provide a chance for you to see ways in which kids have interacted with this. So here's an example of a story from Landon, who is a kindergartner, or was a kindergartner last year when I worked with him. And he wrote a book called How to Use a Chainsaw, which I just love on so many levels. So if I'm going to model for my students how to ask questions, I'm going to open up my mind for the student and let them see inside the brain of a reader. And so I might hold up this book that he wrote to the class, and I might just start right here and say, how do you use a chainsaw? Okay, I have so many questions when I look at this title. Like, how does Landon, a 6-year-old, know about chainsaws? And does he have, does he watch TV shows, or does he have people in his life that have given him access to this? And what I can do as a teacher is I can choose to use something like this, which is an anchor chart, and I can write down my questions before, during, and after reading, or I can also just do it orally. So for the sake of this webinar, I have filled it in as I was working with a group of students. So here's some of my questions I had that I just mentioned to you. How did he think of this topic? How does he know how to use a chainsaw? And I'm also maybe wondering, am I going to learn the steps? Like, maybe I'll leave with some expertise in something I don't know. So as we continue reading, I can continue modeling this think aloud with Landon's story. And as I read, first you turn on the chainsaw. Next, you cut down a tree. So now I can stop and model asking questions during the reading. So I can ask questions like things I'm wondering about. Is the chainsaw heavy? can you cut it down a tree by yourself? Where does he go to cut down trees? So as I finish up this story, he writes, finally, you sit on a tree, the end, and in very typical kindergarten fashion, the end. So after we've read the story, I can continue modeling some questions I'm asking, like, has Landon used a chainsaw before? Has he watched someone use a chainsaw? And we can generate those questions. And I can choose to just think aloud myself, or I can open up to the students around me to also provide their questions. And I think what's most important, or just as important as modeling this asking of questions, is to also model that metacognitive piece, which is asking kids, how did asking questions help me as a reader? To get back to the why we use it, the goal isn't just to have a bunch of questions listed, but that those questions really did something to me as a reader. So in this case, it made me want to know more about chainsaws and using them. I have more questions for Landon. I also know more about the author. I know that Landon has experience or expertise, and that he's someone I could go to with these types of questions. So as a teacher, I can do this think aloud. I can model the thinking that goes on in my mind. I can unzip my brain and show what's happening. And then I can also release that responsibility to the students around me. I can ask them to do the thinking, pairing up with a partner, and sharing. And I provided just a couple of prompts that could work with asking questions, so clearly there are countless other questions. I think what's important to note about these questions is that they're those higher order questions. They require some deeper thinking. So some examples are, what are you wondering about? So if I read aloud for students, I could stop. I could ask them to think about what they're wondering about, pair up, and then share that with their partner. Or maybe I could ask, you know, are you curious why the author used a certain word? And of course, I would include that word I was thinking of. Or do you want to know more about one of the characters? And this type of opportunity can be done as I read aloud and kids respond in the carpet area or at their desk, or it can happen in small group literacy discussions, literature circles, or guided reading groups. Or even after independent reading, you could say, you know, think about the book you read today and partner up with someone for, you know, 2 or 3 minutes, and to allow that social engagement that we know kids appreciate and thrive in, that opportunity to talk. And it's through that talk that their thinking can change. So what I want to do is provide a chance for you to try it. And what I've included today is an excerpt from Neil Gaiman's 2009 American Library Association Newbery Medal acceptance speech for his book, The Graveyard Book. And what I would like for you to do, let's try this. If you could read this, and then in the chat function, could you type in some of your responses? What are some of your questions that you have to see about trying this cognitive reading strategy? So I'll give you just a little bit of time to read and to start sharing some of your questions. Any questions people have that would be willing to type into the chat function here? Well, perhaps that section isn't working for you. Oh, here comes some. In Carol's question, I wonder about the feral children who raise themselves in the stacks. Yes, I can think about these kinds of students, I know. Well, we'll have a chance to try this again. With the next strategy as well. The next strategy I'd like to talk about is inferring. And you're probably really aware of inferring. It's that person that you don't necessarily want to sit by you in a movie theater because they're always telling you what they think is going to happen and talking in your ear during the time you're trying to just sit and enjoy. So Keene and Zimmerman define inferring as combining background knowledge with information from the text to predict, conclude, make judgments, and interpret. It's that reading between the lines. It's coming up with thoughts that aren't explicitly written in the text. So why do readers infer? Readers want to develop interpretations about the author's intentions. They wonder, want to revise their thinking, understand new vocabulary, and combine what they already know with the text to answer questions that they have. So here's a poem that was written by 2 fifth graders I worked with last year. And what I'd like to do is model thinking aloud this poem. So I'll read it through one time. Magic is a Band-Aid for the heart. Magic is a rip in hate and a roar in forgiveness. In a blink, you're sorry. The hate will drip and sizzle, and you will have forgiven. So if I'm going to stop for kids and I'm going to model what it means to infer, here's a response I might give. See, I'm inferring about magic and what magic means in this poem. And I'm feeling like magic is like an apology, because an apology can be a Band-Aid for the heart. It can rip hate and can bring in forgiveness. And I'm inferring about this idea about in a blink you're sorry. The hate will drip and sizzle. So if I'm thinking about apologizing, even when you've done something wrong, it still lasts, right? It drips, it sizzles, it has a long-term impact. So I'm thinking about inferring that these boys have experienced that, and they realize that even if you have given an apology, it doesn't just fix the problem completely. It still has a longer-term impact. And I'm thinking about Carol's presentation, and this idea of creating sensory and emotional images and how that using the language of drip and sizzle provides that. So clearly, as readers, we don't just use one strategy at a time, and it's really easy to model for kids how multiple things are happening at once. And I'm breaking in my background experience, my schema with being hurt and having an apology, but I'm also bringing in the emotional and visual imagery along with my inferring. So I have a few examples of inferring. We can infer at the word level, we can infer at the sentence level, and we can infer at the whole text level. And I want to show a few examples of working with kids with inferring. So I just finished up a reading group with a group of 4th graders. They're a group of 4 kids that have recently exited from their English language development services, and we've been reading Anne McGovern's book, Shark Lady, True Adventures of Eugenie Clark. And Eugenie Clark is a pioneer, a woman pioneer in the field of science. She was an ichthyologist, a researcher that studied fish. And so here's a little excerpt from that text. And one of the students in my group asked, "What is gobble?" And it's from the sentence, "First, the sharks swam toward the Moses soul with their mouths open, ready to gobble the little fish. Then, with their jaws still wide open, sharks jerked away." So, in actuality, in my literature circle discussion with my group, we did not write down our information in a chart like this, though we could have, but we chose just to orally talk about the word. So one of the students asked what was gobble. So I asked the students, well, what do you already know about that word? And I started hearing sounds of gobbling and people talking about the sound that a turkey makes. And so we went back to the text and said, okay, well, what did the author give us for some clues? And then we made an inference. One of the students said, oh, I think it's like eat. And so we went back and we looked at the text and we said, okay, will eat work? Would it work to say, first the sharks swam toward the Moses soul with their mouths open, ready to eat a little fish? And we agreed it did, and we talked about this idea, this nuance of language, how words like eat and gobble and devour and nibble, they all have very nuanced meanings. And so as a reader, to infer those words and to pick words to infer that have those nuances. Here's an example of inferring and interpretation. So this is from Kylie, who's a kindergartner, and she had read with her, or her teacher had read to her, The Little Red Hen. And I'm sure you're familiar with the story, but Little Red Hen finds some wheat, and she asks her friends if they'll help her in the various stages of turning it into bread. And each time she asks her friends, they always say, not I. And then when it comes time, when the bread is made and coming out of the oven, and she asks if they would like to, eat the bread, and she doesn't let the other animals because they did not help, and she eats it herself. And so the students were asked to infer their interpretation. What did they think? Did the Little Red Hen make the right choice? And here Kylie replies, I think the Little Red Hen should not share because the other animals did not do all of the work. The animals were relaxing. So you can see her inference is based on her personal opinion. And as kids get older, they start to go back to the text and find evidence. This is an example of kids inferring. It's an example of a written response, which sometimes we do this cognitive reading strategy work orally, and sometimes we do this strategy by having kids write or draw. And here's an example after reading the book Smoky Night, which is set in LA after some riots occurred. And it's the story of these neighbors that at first didn't get along, but then through a difficult time, these riots and a fire in their apartment complex, they were drawn together. And so here's an example of students that were inferring the theme of the story, the main idea, that it was about finding something new, about friendship. And in this opportunity, kids had a chance to draw, to sketch a symbol of to symbolize their word that describe their theme or their meaning. And so like asking questions, we can also gradually release that responsibility to students. We can ask them as we read aloud or in a small group reading time or after independent reading to try on this strategy, to prompt them to be thinking in these ways, to infer, how did you know this was going to happen, or that you had this interpretation of the text? Or stopping when we read and asking kids to say, how would you describe this character so far, and why? having them go back to the text, draw from their life experience. And when students infer about what will happen next, once again, asking those why questions, getting deeper, higher order questions with kids that go beyond just literal recall. So here's an example or an excerpt from Molly Bang's book, Ocean Sunlight, How Tiny Plants Feed the Seas. And we'll try this one more time if people are willing to read this text and see if you can make an inference, infer, and add it into our chat function here. And let's share some of our inferences. All right, perhaps not everyone has the chat function, or maybe you're in a large group and it's hard to share that feature. But thanks for trying along, and perhaps you can have others read this text example and give it a try. So the last cognitive reading strategy that I'm going to address is determining importance. And Keenan Zimmerman defined this as deciding what matters most, what's worth remembering. And we are bombarded in our life with information, and so we are, as humans, forced to decide what's most important. What are we going to remember? What will we do? How will we spend our time? And this same processes can be transferred to reading to determine from all this text we read what is really important. So why do readers determine importance? You know, how does it help them as a reader, as a person? It can help them sift through information, decide what's most important, help them learn something new. It may affirm their values or beliefs, or perhaps even revise their values or beliefs. They do it to name the key ideas or themes, and they can do it to develop empathy. So what I have is an example from a third grader of a poem she wrote. It's a bio poem, so she was given the sentence stem to start, like I wonder, I hear, I see, and she was asked to finish each of those sentences. Describing herself. So in this poem she says, I wonder how I ever learn. I hear other people laugh. I see myself being a friend. I want to help others. I am a friend. I pretend when I get the chance. I feel good about myself. I catch my pencil. I worry that things are too hard. I cry that I will never stop taking tests. I am a student. I understand reading. I say, keep going. You can do it. I dream to be good at math. I try really hard. I hope I'm doing enough. I am me. So if I am going to unzip my mind, if I'm going to open it for students and model what it means to determine importance, I might say to students, wow, when I read this poem, thinking about sort of the context, like clearly this is in the era of testing and high stakes testing and increased expectations to the new standards that are being developed, at least in the United States in our context. So I get that, getting that sort of underlying piece. And I'm also seeing really the stage of life that this third grader is in. You know, she both loves to pretend when she gets a chance, which means she doesn't get to do it all the time. And she also has this focus on these high academic focus. So she's in between these worlds of, you know, play and pretend, and as well as these new academic demands. And I also get the sense of, when I think about determining importance in this poem, that there's this both and, that she has a strong sense of self about being a friend and helping others, and there's other things she's sort of anxious or worried about. And I think as humans we can resonate with that we're often multiple things all at once. So that's an example of a Think Aloud. What I want to show you is some ways in which I've seen teachers teach this concept of determining importance. So here's an example from Amy Widmer's 5th grade class, and they read The Sign of the Beaver. And what they did as a class is, after they read each chapter, they would talk, and once again, that importance of dialogue, and they would determine what was most important, how could they summarize that chapter, and they kept that timeline posted in their classroom. Once again, going back to the Lit Circle group I've been working with in 4th grade, reading The Shark Lady, this is an example of a note-taking sheet. The students, as they read, they just jotted down things about the author, or excuse me, about Eugenie Clark. It was a biography about her life. What kinds of things did she say and think? What did she do? What do other people say? And kids had, you know, 2-3 pages of information. And this was, you know, writing down. But then, to connect up to determining importance, we looked at, okay, look at all those things you wrote down. Think about everything you've read and what you know from your life, and what do you think really, what's a trait that really defines Eugenie Clark? So here's 2 examples. One was she was adventurous. She's not scared to swim with sharks. She's curious. She wanted to know about the sleeping sharks and all types of sharks. So kids were able to read text, to jot down notes, and then through conversation, we didn't get there just by handing out a piece of paper, but through a lot of conversation, discuss what were the traits that would define Eugenie Clark. How can we decide what was most important about her life? And then on the last day of our reading group, we had this big piece of chart paper with an outline of a person, and we started talking, and you know, all right, we've got all these things she thought and said. Well, what's most important? What really defines her? What's most important about the places she went and what she did? And you know, I just love how kids work, and these 9-year-olds together. One of them said, Alexis said, you know what we need to do? We need to put veins through her. You know that when they say, you know, what runs through her veins? And it was just this wonderful moment where a 9-year-old provides insight and direction. I mean, really, that's what determining importance is, right? What ran through her veins, Eugenie Clark's veins, what was most important? And they wrote things like learning ran through her veins, her children, adventure, and then they knew that the veins connected to the heart, so they made that connection to things that she loved and cared, fish and her family. I really appreciate how kids bring concepts together for me as well. Here's an example of a written response. Students read a folk tale called The Grain of Rice by Denny, and they talked to the whole class, and then they were asked to write what they thought the theme of the story was. And here's an example of Ashlyn. She said, the theme of the story is always be wise in your actions. It is also to not think of yourself as all that, because one day you might get it. Like Rani, she was wise because first she did not just think of herself. And the king said he would give her a reward for doing a nice deed. She thought of other people who needed food. And that's the theme of this story. So we can have kids write that, and you can see that evidence here connecting back to the text. So once again, as we gradually release that responsibility to students to try these cognitive reading strategies on their own, we can prompt them with some higher order deep questions. And I wouldn't recommend, listing all of these, but picking one and having kids think about it, pair up, maybe find a smaller group of 3 or their table group, and to share. And not just share their answers, but what made them think that, to really dive in deeper to that metacognitive piece, to think about their thinking. I've included another example for try it, and perhaps I'll just give you a little bit to read this. But this excerpt comes from a text by Holly Reed, and Heidi Heibert has a website called textproject.org. It's a nonprofit group with a focus of getting texts to kids that are accessible for struggling and early readers, and to provide teachers with strategies and means to do that. So if you haven't had a chance to check out that website, there's a lot of text that you can download and use with kids, as well as other materials for teachers. So I'll be quiet for a moment here, let you read this excerpt, and see if you want to try determining importance, either in your mind or through the chat function. I hope I gave you enough time to try out that strategy. I'm going to conclude today just by revisiting a few of the big ideas. First, that we as teachers have to really be readers and thinkers, and to model that for kids. When we can draw upon our own experience of reading and reflecting and talking with others, we'll model that. We'll be able to draw from those experiences as we teach kids these same strategies and thinking. We don't just do them for academic purposes in schools, but they really do improve our lives and deepen our understanding. And the whole idea of strategic reading is to enhance learning and understanding. It's not to name the cognitive reading strategies. It's not to have a list of questions or a sheet filled out or a drawing done about a character in a book, but to really enhance our learning and our understanding. Once again, that these cognitive reading strategies are a means to an end. They are not the end in themselves, and that we really need to focus in on reading engagement and motivation. We often talk about reading levels and reading scores, but if we spent more time thinking about the books that would engage kids, how we could create space in our classroom for kids to talk more, and to talk more about higher order, deeper types of questions and issues, the more likely they will be engaged, and therefore we'll see the results of that in their increased ability to read and comprehend more complex text. We can't talk enough about giving kids chances and opportunities to talk. And when we use these strategies, we don't need to use them, individually, but we can integrate them and use them flexibly with all sorts of text, nonfiction, novels, poetry, our social studies textbook. We can incorporate them throughout our learning and teaching experience. So I've just got a few slides that have the references from this webinar, and I'm really appreciative for you participating today. I welcome your questions and comments, so I will entertain those through the chat function.